She was still bleeding when he told her she disgusted him. 10 days out of surgery. Staples holding her stomach together. 2 newborns in her arms. And Jae-woo Kim, Chicago's Dragon of the East, stood over her, looked her dead in the eye, and said she smelled like milk and failure. That she had carried his heirs in a broken vessel. That whatever she had passed to his sons through her ruined body, they would spend their lives trying to overcome. He kicked her reaching hand away from her own children, had her dragged through the service elevator so the neighbors wouldn't see, and as the elevator doors closed, she heard them, her sons, crying. That sound lasted 4 seconds. Then the mechanical hum swallowed it whole. Then silence. They dropped her in a Chicago alleyway in February. She hit the frozen slush. Her post-op fever raged a cruel heat against the cold, seeping up from the ground and not stopping. The silk soaked through in seconds, fabric sealing against her fresh wounds, stitches straining with every breath. She lay there, and the cold didn't feel like cold. It felt like the verdict she'd been dodging since the first kick. That was his first mistake. Yvonne Taylor didn't die in that alley. She made a decision. And for the next 2 years, Jae-woo Kim would slowly, completely, and very quietly lose his mind, and never once understand why. The penthouse smelled like ozone and fear on the night Jae-woo Kim became a monster. Not that he hadn't always been one. Yvonne understood that now, sitting on the edge of the velvet bed, her body still screaming from the surgery, her silk robe damp against her skin. She understood it the way you understand a thing only after it's too late to act on it. The roses in Paris. The honeymoon in Kyoto. The hand he had pressed to her stomach the first time the boys kicked. His face cracked open with something that had looked like wonder. All of it had been performance. Every last piece of it. And she had been the most willing audience member in the room, weeping at a show never written with her survival in mind. She should have read the applause for what it was. Jae-woo stood over her, 6'2", immaculate in black. Every inch of him, the Dragon of the East, the man Chicago's underworld referenced in lowered voices and studied from the periphery of their vision. He had the particular physical stillness of a man who had never once needed volume to be obeyed. He looked at her the way he looked at things that had outlived their usefulness. Like a cracked vase, like an engine that had seized. "Look at you," he said. His voice was a saw without a handle. A sagging, leaking ruin. "You look like a gutter-bred animal that's outlived its purpose." Jae-woo. His name broke in her throat. "I almost died on that table. I haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since they came home. I just need a little more. You need to shut your mouth." She tightened her hold on the boys without thinking. The oldest instruction encoded in the human body. From the doorway, Sora watched. Crystal earrings, red lips, the precise, assembled elegance of a woman who had mapped every step of her ambition and never once lost her footing. She laughed a delicate sound, engineered to feel like a paper cut in a wound you hadn't noticed yet. "The help says she cries in the shower," Sora said, "so the babies won't hear her breaking down." A beat, weighted with satisfaction. Pathetic. Jae-woo reached into his jacket and let the photographs fall onto the velvet one by one. Yvonne looked down, glassy-eyed, slack-jawed, tilting sideways with the expression of a woman who had no business being near anything fragile. She had never looked like that. Not naturally, but she had felt like it. Every morning for 6 weeks. After the tea, the thermos left outside her door by Sora's assistant chamomile, she'd been told. Something warm and restorative, delivered with a smile she now understood had been the smile of someone watching a plan succeed. The room tilting, her heartbeat arriving a half-beat late. She had blamed the surgery, the blood loss, the fractured sleep of a woman with 2 newborns. She looked at the photographs and understood, in one cold and absolute moment, that her confusion had been manufactured, induced, documented for exactly this use. She had not been losing her mind. Her mind had been taken. Standing 3 feet behind Jae-woo, Sora reached up and touched the diamond pendant at her throat, a nervous gesture, barely perceptible. A tell. Yvonne filed it away without changing her expression. Near the door, the head of security, Kwan, stood with his hands clasped and his eyes fixed on the wall above Yvonne's head. 15 years in Jae-woo's service. Patient. Invisible. Trusted completely because he had never once given reason not to be, which, Yvonne now understood, was exactly the discipline of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to give a very different kind of reason. Kwan's eyes moved to hers for 1 second, less than 1 second. Then back to the wall. She understood. "Get out," Jae-woo said. "Before I decide a dead ex-wife is tidier than a divorced one." She held her sons and looked at him and did not beg again. 2 minutes later, the men came. A service corridor, an elevator that stopped nowhere public. And then February in Chicago hit her like a sentence, and she was on the wet concrete of the alley, with her staples pulling, and her son's 30 floors above her, and the cold ground under her palm. She pressed her hand flat against it. She did not break. She started counting. The burner phone was in her pocket. She found it at 3 in the morning when the rain had pulled back to a cold mist, and she had gotten herself upright against the alley wall using nothing but the specific, furious decision of a woman who has chosen that the ground is not where her story ends. Prepaid. Untraceable. A brass key sewn into the inner seam of the robe. A strip of paper with a Southside address in handwriting she recognized before she had consciously registered recognizing it. Quan. She had known him for 4 years as Jae-woo's man. Thorough, invisible, entirely trusted. What Jae-woo had never bothered to investigate because men who have always been given loyalty do not think to audit its origins was who Quan had been before he was ever his, before Chicago. Before the Empire, Quan had served Yvonne's father for 12 years, and Jae-woo had destroyed her father to take his first step up. She walked 40 blocks in a silk robe and no shoes, bleeding slowly into the fabric, the city moving around her with complete indifference. The safe house was a studio above a laundromat, where the buildings leaned into each other, and nobody asked questions, because the people who lived there had learned that questions rarely returned anything useful. A cot. 4 walls. A first aid kit under the sink. Cash in a shoebox under the floorboards. She allowed herself 1 hour on that cot, not managed grief, not clinical detachment. She curled on her side and pressed both fists against her sternum and let it move through her, like a current, until it had run its full length. 60 minutes of the realest thing she had ever felt. Then she stood up, done, and opened the first aid kit. Within a week she had 3 jobs. Pre-dawn office cleaning in buildings where the marble reflected nothing back. Warehouse freight work on the south side, where the surgery scar burned every shift, and she treated that burn as information rather than instruction. Night kitchen scrubbing until her hands cracked and bled, and built something tougher over the raw places. Every dollar above survival went into a burner account. Every spare hour went into study. She reconnected with the old guard men Jae-woo had displaced on his rise, who carried specific and patient grievances, and had been waiting for something worth organizing around. From them, she learned the architecture of the Kim Empire, where the money moved, where the records were stored, where the foundations were thinnest. She trained through the scar tissue until it hardened and silvered and stopped pulling. She learned what she had never needed to know as a penthouse wife. At night, when the laundromat hummed below her and the city moved without her, she thought about the tea, the compound. What sustained microdosing does to a mind already running on guilt and paranoia, already half convinced that the ground beneath it is less solid than it appears. She thought about what would happen if someone turned that weapon around. 6 months in, she stopped grieving. She started building. 1 year after the alley, the baby monitors in the Kim penthouse began to malfunction, small enough to dismiss at first. A low crackle at 3 in the morning, white noise that pulsed rather than resting flat. And then, inside the crackle, a lullaby, low and slow. A Southside melody with no business being inside a 43rd floor smart home system in the deepest part of the night. Jae-woo heard it on a Tuesday, and was down the hall before he was fully awake. The nursery was silent, the boys asleep. He stood in the doorway for 2 full minutes, listening to nothing, his pulse conducting itself in a way that was new and unwelcome. He had not been afraid of a sound since he was 7 years old. He was not about to start naming it now. Stress, he told himself. Fatigue. The same explanation served him 4 nights later when it happened again. And the week after, when his wedding ring appeared inside a safe whose combination he had changed twice, when his watch moved from the nightstand to the bathroom sink overnight, when a bottle of Yvonne's perfume, one he had personally thrown away 8 months prior, appeared on the kitchen counter on a Thursday morning, half empty, with the faint press of fingers in the glass. He swept the penthouse. His team found nothing. He replaced the entire smart home system. 11 days later, the lullaby returned. What Jae-woo could not have imagined was that Yvonne had moved back into the building, not into an apartment, into the crawl space above the 42nd floor, into the maintenance infrastructure, the ducts and junctions and service corridors invisible to anyone who had never spent 6 months memorizing architectural plans in a laundromat studio. She had mapped every camera angle, every blind spot, every sweep pattern the security team followed without varying. She lived in his walls. She played the lullaby through a microspeaker, no larger than a coin, at precisely 3 a.m., watching his response through a pinhole camera she had placed in a ventilation grill the month before. The crawlspace was 14 inches of clearance and cold metal, and the perpetual hum of the building's mechanical systems. She lay on her stomach some nights, and pressed her eye to a different grill, one that looked directly into the nursery, and watched her sons sleep. They were growing. The elder one had started pulling himself upright against the crib rails. The younger laughed in his sleep sometimes, a sound she felt rather than fully heard, muffled through the ductwork. She had pressed her fingertips flat against the metal, 3 feet of infrastructure between her hands and her children, and breathed through it, quietly, without making a sound. That was the real cost of the ghost life. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the physical discipline of moving through a building without leaving evidence of herself. It was watching her sons learn to stand through a hole the size of a thumb, knowing that if she made one wrong sound, one wrong move, they would be taken somewhere she would never find them. She did not let herself think about it for longer than she could afford. She stored it in the part of herself where the hour on the cot had gone, the part that was full and sealed, and would be opened only once, at the very end, when she could finally afford the feeling. Meanwhile, something else was unraveling in the penthouse. Sora began finding things. First, a bracelet, Yvonne's, the one she had worn at their engagement dinner, which Sora had watched Jae-woo throw into the waste disposal months ago. It appeared in Sora's jewelry box one morning between her own pieces, as if it had always been there. Sora stared at it for a long moment, then called the housekeeper. The housekeeper had not touched the box. Sora placed the bracelet in a drawer and did not mention it to Jae-woo. 3 days later, she caught 2 members of the household staff exchanging a look when she entered the kitchen. Not a conspiratorial look, a careful one, the specific expression of people who have been instructed not to react and are working at it. Sora was very good at reading rooms. She stood at the kitchen counter and understood, with a slow and spreading certainty, that the people in this house no longer entirely belonged to her. She poured her coffee and carried it back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about exits. She was still thinking about them when Jae-woo appeared in the doorway, looked at the wall above her head, and said the lullaby had come back. The syndicate met on the first Thursday of every month in a private room above a steakhouse on Michigan Avenue. 12 men. Single slab mahogany. Business concluded in murmurs and silence, the way rooms that have never needed to perform power actually operate. Jae-woo had presided at this table for 11 years. He had never been late. Not once. In the world these men occupied together, punctuality was not a courtesy. It was a declaration of continued relevance. He arrived 40 minutes late. He did not explain. He sat, buttoned his jacket, and opened his ledger. The room did not arrange itself around him with its usual speed. There was a beat brief, almost imperceptible where no one moved. And in that beat, something shifted that Jae-woo felt before he understood. Then he looked at the ledger. The numbers were wrong. Not subtly, grotesquely. Columns filled with symbols. Between them, printed cleanly. Photographs. Yvonne in the hospital. Yvonne in the alley. Yvonne looking directly into a camera with an expression that was not grief and not desperation. He recognized her handwriting in the margins before he could stop himself. He snapped the ledger shut. "A technical matter," he said. "Continue." Silence. Then Elder Cho, at the far end of the table, set down his pen with a precision that filled the room. "We have been patient, Jae-woo," Cho said, not unkindly, worse than unkindly, with the tone of a man who has already completed his thinking on a subject and is now informing you of his conclusions. A distracted general is a battlefield liability. There are younger men who have expressed interest in the responsibilities you currently hold. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "We would not wish for a transition to become necessary." The word transition landed like a stone dropped into standing water. Around the table, no one met Jae-woo's eyes. Not from discomfort, from the particular discretion of men who have already decided which side of a change they are standing on. Jae-woo's jaw tightened. "No transition will be necessary." "Good," said Cho. He picked up his pen. "Then we continue." They continued. Jae-woo sat at the head of the mahogany and performed authority for 90 minutes, while something cold moved through him, spreading outward from the word transition, taking the temperature of everything it touched. What he did not know was that the ledger had been switched that morning by a man who had managed his office for 11 years and had held a copy of his key for 4 months. That 3 men at this table had received a single encrypted message, 2 sentences, no sender mapping the precise anatomy of the Kim Empire's finances and where, specifically, its organs were most exposed. That the old guard had quietly, completely rerouted around him. He drove home alone. He sat in the back of the car and looked at Chicago through the window and tried to locate the exact moment when control had begun to feel like a performance he was giving for an audience he could no longer see. He could not find it. That was the point. He saw her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in November. He was at the window of his private office, 43 floors up, the city laid out below him in its cold geometry. A glass of scotch in his hand, untouched. Sora was elsewhere in the penthouse, present the way furniture is present, which was how things had been between them for weeks now. She had grown quieter, more careful with her exits from rooms. He had noticed, but had not yet had the bandwidth to examine it. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. And behind his reflection, slightly left of center, standing in the middle of the office with her arms at her sides, was Yvonne. Silk robe, wet hair, eyes that did not blink. He spun. The scotch went across the floor. Empty room. He turned back. His reflection. Only his reflection. He stood there for a long time. Then he poured a new glass, sat down in the chair facing the door, and held it with both hands, and told himself the only true thing available. He was a rational man under extraordinary sustained pressure, and what he had seen was the byproduct of a mind running at a deficit. He was very persuasive. He had needed to be very persuasive to himself frequently in recent months. The scotch tasted wrong. Faintly metallic, a bitterness at the back of the throat that arrived a second after the swallow, and then sat there, present and unresolved. He told himself it was the ice. He took another sip. The bitterness deepened. He set the glass down. Then he picked it back up. Because what was the alternative? That someone had... No, he had swept this penthouse 6 times. He had replaced the staff, the system, the locks. He was a man of absolute control in a controlled environment, and the scotch tasted the way it tasted, because he was tired, and because fatigue changes the palate, and because there was no other explanation that was acceptable to him. He finished the glass. The room stayed still for the rest of the night. No reflections. No lullaby. He went to bed with the lights on and slept for 2 hours and woke with the absolute certainty that Yvonne was standing at the foot of the bed. She wasn't. He checked. He stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at every corner, and she was not there. He went back to bed, closed his eyes, and in the dark behind his eyelids she was standing in the alley, still in the silk robe, rain on her face, pressing her palm flat against the ground with an expression that was not defeat. He opened his eyes, stared at the ceiling. The question came to him before he could intercept it. What expression had that been? He didn't sleep again. The next evening, he saw her reflection in the darkened screen of his laptop. The evening after that, in the back of a spoon at a business dinner, he looked down and found her looking back and left the table without explaining his departure to the 3 men sitting with him. She appeared in his bedroom on 4 consecutive nights, always in the same spot, always in the same robe, always gone when he turned on the light. Was she real? Was the drug, if there was a drug, summoning her from his guilt? Or was she actually standing there, actually 3 feet away from him in the dark? He could not hold both possibilities in his hands at once, without one of them feeling true, and he no longer fully trusted which one his hands were capable of holding. He stopped sleeping with anything less than every light in the penthouse burning. He covered every mirror. He replaced the scotch, sourced directly by his own hand from a sealed bottle purchased at a shop where no one knew his name. It still tasted metallic. It still sat wrong at the back of his throat. By December, he was checking behind doors before he entered rooms. By January, he was conducting the checks twice. The Dragon of the East had begun to be afraid of his own building. And in the crawl space above the 42nd floor, Yvonne watched him through the pinhole camera, her face a mask of cold and total concentration, and did not allow herself to feel anything about it yet. Feeling was for the end. She was still in the middle. The argument started over a misplaced phone. Jae-woo had left it on the nightstand. He reached for it. It was on the vanity. He asked Sora if she had moved it. She said no. He used the tone controlled, specific, the one that had always functioned as a perimeter warning. Sora raised her voice, which told him, even through the fog of everything else, that her own nerves had reached a threshold. He grabbed her wrist. He looked at her, and the room did what rooms had been doing to him for months. Sora's skin was not flawless. Silver lines ran across her stomach, her sides, the soft skin beneath her ribs. Yvonne's lines, Yvonne's body. And then the face changed one breath. One single suspended moment, and it was Yvonne looking at him with the expression he had been seeing in the dark. Not anger, not grief, pity. He let go of Sora's wrist. He knocked the nightstand off the wall. The voice that came out of his throat was not one he recognized. Sora locked herself in the ensuite and sat on the tile floor and looked at her hands. She was not a woman who had entered this arrangement with her eyes closed. She had known what Jae-woo was. She had calculated that his proximity to power was worth the cost of proximity to him. She had spent 4 years making that calculation balance. But the calculation had always assumed he would remain what he had been controlled. Formidable. A man whose cruelty was at least organized. What was happening outside that bathroom door was not organized. It was coming apart at seams she had not known existed. She was also not a woman who had been passive in his deterioration. She had been watching it for 6 months, had been quietly, carefully helping it along, redirecting his medication budget, replacing his prescriptions with compounds that compounded whatever else was already being done to him. She had been playing her own long game. She had been betting on being the last one standing, but something had shifted in the household in the past 3 weeks that she could not account for. The staff no longer met her eyes, not with hostility, but with the careful neutrality of people who had received updated instructions. The bracelet had appeared in her jewelry box again, even after she had removed it twice. And this morning she had found, tucked into the frame of her own mirror, a photograph. Small, printed on plain paper. Yvonne at the engagement dinner, in the bracelet, looking straight at the camera. Not a threat. Not a message with words. Just, I was here. I am still here. And I know exactly where you keep your things. Sora reached for her private phone. She looked at the offshore account balance. She thought about the vault codes she had spent 4 months memorizing. She thought about the car she had arranged, the route she had planned, the window she had identified as the cleanest exit. She went downstairs with one bag. The car was in the basement, where she had arranged it. She got in. The partition came down. Yvonne Taylor turned around from the driver's seat and looked at her with the steady, unhurried expression of someone for whom this moment had been on the calendar for a long time. Sora looked back. Even now, especially now, she was still calculating. The vault codes, Yvonne said. For a new identity, safe passage out of Chicago, and enough money to start somewhere he will never think to look. Or you get out of this car and take your chances with a man who is no longer capable of protecting anyone, including himself. Sora held her gaze for 6 seconds. Then she placed a folded piece of paper on the console between them. Smart, Yvonne said. She pulled into traffic without looking back. 2 years to the day after the alley, Jae-woo Kim dressed for his own funeral. He did not know it as that. He stood at the bathroom sink. Every mirror in the penthouse had been covered for 6 weeks, and knotted his tie 4 times before his hands produced it correctly. The tremor was worse in the mornings. He registered this the way you register something that has been true long enough to have lost the capacity to surprise you. He had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in over a month. He walked to the drinks cabinet and poured a glass and stood at the sink and poured it away. He watched it drain. He had stopped trusting the scotch weeks ago and still reached for it every morning because the body does not shed its rituals simply because the mind has identified them as suspect. The penthouse had been rewired twice, staff replaced 4 times. He had done everything a man with unlimited resources could do to make his home feel like his again. The wrongness remained. Atmospheric now. Structural. It was the feeling of being watched in a building where every camera fed to a monitor he controlled, and knowing that knowing the source does not dissolve the paranoia it produces. He thought about Yvonne. He had assessed her, on that velvet bed, with the full confidence of a man who had never once miscalculated a threat. She is relational, he had thought. She needs the architecture of this life to hold herself together. Remove it and she dissolves. He had been so certain that the certainty had not even felt like a choice, it had felt like a fact he had simply observed. He had been wrong about one thing in his entire career. He went to the gala. The Field Museum had been dressed for a dynasty. Chandeliers over marble, black ties and diamonds. The assembled power of Chicago's elite gathered in a room to remind itself of its own face. He moved through the crowd, or performed moving through it. The faces tilted slightly before steadying. The floor had a quality beneath his feet that he could not name. He was running a low, constant fever of wrongness that no longer had a single origin point because it was no longer coming from outside him. He reached the podium, gripped both sides of it. He looked out at the room. The room tilted, not in a way anyone else would see. But the faces in the front rows shifted in that particular way. They had been shifting for months now, slightly too much, slightly too long, and the chandeliers threw light that felt targeted, and the back of his throat tasted of metal. And Jae-woo Kim stood at the head of his room and understood, for the first time, with his entire body, that he was afraid, not of what he could see, of what he could no longer be certain he was seeing accurately. The lights flickered. When the emergency reds came on, the room changed color, and at the far end of the center aisle, in the doorway, a figure appeared that was solid in a way that everything else had stopped being. Jae-woo Kim knew the difference between real and not real. He had been insisting on that for months. He knew the difference. Yvonne Taylor was real. She didn't wear a dress. Tactical black from collar to boot. Hair cropped short and sharp. She walked down the center aisle with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who has already won and is here only to close the account. The room parted around her without fully understanding why. The body reads authority before the mind assembles the language for it. "I let myself in," Yvonne said. Her voice came through the house speakers she had been in the system for 4 days. "I came to see what you built on my blood, Jae-woo." Jae-woo's hands left the podium. He stepped backward, something the room had never seen him do. "You're not real." First a whisper, then louder, with the rising pressure of a man whose grip on his own argument is failing. "You're the shadows. You're what I see when I was never in your head." She stopped 3 feet from the podium, completely steady. "I was in your medicine. I was in your scotch. I was in the crawl space above the 42nd floor, watching you through your own cameras, for 14 months. She let that land. "I was in the loyalty of every man you used and discarded. I was in your ledgers before you opened them. I was in the ear of every person at this table who helped me hollow your empire out from the inside while you stood at the top of it and screamed at shadows." She took 1 step closer. "The FBI is at the gates right now, for the trafficking operation that has run under your name for 9 years. Your accounts are empty. Your ledgers are in federal custody. The men you trusted most signed their affidavits last month." She leaned in. Her voice dropped to something that was only for him. "You are not a king," she said. "You are a man in an expensive suit who dropped his match in the gutter and forgot to watch what caught fire." She stepped back, looked at him one last time, not with hatred, because hatred requires ongoing investment, and she had spent that resource on something more useful with the clear, finished expression of a woman closing a door she will never need to open again. She turned away. The doors at the back of the hall opened. The footsteps that followed were numerous and deliberate, and wearing the shoes of people with federal authority. Jae-woo did not run. He did not fight. He stood at the podium in his $10,000 tuxedo and looked at the chandelier and laughed. It started at a register that might briefly have been mistaken for composure, then climbed beyond dignity, beyond reason, into a frequency with no ceiling and no floor. He was pointing upward. He was talking about milk and failure and something filling the room that only he could perceive. The agents exchanged a look. They called for the medical team. They did not use handcuffs. They buckled him into a restraint jacket. And he was still laughing when they wheeled him through the service entrance, through the same type of back corridor, the same type of exit that he had used to remove his wife on the worst night of her life. The room watched in the silence that falls when power collapses in public. Yvonne was already gone. She didn't watch him go. She was through the service corridor before the buckles were fastened, on the back stairs, covering the distance to the east wing with the focused stride of a woman who has been waiting 2 years for this moment and will not spend a second of it looking at what she already knows. Kwon was outside the door at the end of the hall, hands clasped, eyes wet in a way he made no effort to conceal. 15 years of discipline and perfect restraint, and he was not concealing this. He met her eyes and nodded once. She nodded back. She opened the door. The VIP lounge was warm and low-lit, and on the carpet, in the center of the room, sat 2 boys, 2 years and 10 days old. Dark eyes, round, serious faces. The arresting, uncomplicated beauty of children who have not yet learned to perform themselves for any audience. They looked up at the sound of the door. Yvonne stopped in the doorway. She had not rehearsed this. She had understood. In the months she had spent watching them grow through a pinhole camera, while pressing her fingertips against cold metal ductwork 3 feet from their sleeping faces, she had understood that there was no framework for this moment. That would make it easier. That when it came, it would simply come, and she would be whatever she was. She knelt on the carpet. She began to hum, low and slow, the South Side lullaby, the melody she had sung to her own stomach before these boys had names or faces, the song she had still been humming on the operating table before the anesthetic took her, the song she had played through a coin-sized speaker into the walls of a man's home not only to unsettle him, but because some part of her had needed them to keep hearing it, had needed to keep sending it to them through whatever infrastructure was available, through ductwork and speaker wire. The only thread she could maintain between herself and her children during 14 months in the walls of a building that was supposed to be his. She had played it to unravel him. She had also played it because she could not stop. The boys watched her. The assessment of small children is among the most precise assessments available to a human being. They have not learned to extend courtesy. They have not learned to perform belief. They took their time. And then something moved through them that had no name at 2 years old, not memory, not recognition in any cognitive sense, but something older than both. Something encoded before they had ears to hear with, in a time when the only things they knew were warmth and darkness, and a low, steady melody coming through the walls of the world. They came to her at a run. She pulled them in, one on each side, the same configuration as the velvet bed, before the men came. She buried her face between them and held on, and for the first time since the alley, since the concrete, since the cold ground under her palm, since the decision, Yvonne Taylor wept, not from weakness, not from grief, from the specific, bodily, irreducible relief of a woman who walked through fire for 2 years with her hands open and came out the other side holding everything that actually mattered. Harriet Tubman knew it long before anyone thought to write it down. Every great dream begins with a dreamer who finds the strength within. Yvonne Taylor had been stripped of everything external, so she had gone inward, found the kind of power that cannot be confiscated, the patience and precision and love that does not negotiate, and used it to dismantle a man who had mistaken her silence for surrender. If this story held you, if you felt the weight of that alley, and the slow, earned satisfaction of watching justice find its level, you already belong here. Subscribe to Ruthless Romance Tales. This is a space for people who understand that the most compelling stories are not about who wins. They are about what winning costs, and who was willing to keep paying it. Before you go, we want to hear from you. At what exact moment did you know Yvonne was going to win? Was it in the alley, when she pressed her palm to the ground and chose not to break? Or was it the moment you realized she had never, not for a single day, stopped being deliberate? Tell us in the comments. We read every word. As the sun came up over Chicago, Yvonne stood at the penthouse window, her window now, by every legal and moral measure. The boys were asleep behind her on the couch, pressed shoulder to shoulder the way they had been in every scan. She looked at the city, Lake Michigan silver at the edge of the skyline. The streets below waking up, the first people of the morning moving through it. The city that had watched her thrown into an alley and had kept going without looking back. She had not needed it to stop for her. She had only needed time. And the woman they had called a carcass looked at Chicago in the early light and smiled with all of her teeth.